Dark Secrets, the bizarre murder of Stephen Cozzi, true crime investigation. The wind howled through the cracked window. Outside, the night was thick with shadows. But inside, the house was silent. Stephen Cozzi stood in the center of the room, motionless. His eyes darted from corner to corner, as if expecting something. The flickering light overhead cast eerie patterns on the walls. A chill swept through the air, and he shivered, not from the cold. It was as if something was there, something unseen. He turned toward the door. A faint sound. Almost imperceptible. He froze. The noise came again, a soft scraping. From the other side of the house. The tension in the room grew thick. Stephen took a step forward, his breath shallow. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an alarm. His heart pounded in his chest. He reached for his phone, but it wasn't there. The sound came again, louder now. A scraping, dragging sound. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Cautiously, he crept toward the hallway. The house felt like it was holding its breath. Another sound. Closer. A door creaked open somewhere in the dark. A cold breeze brushed his skin. But there was no wind. The temperature seemed to drop. Suddenly, the light above him flickered and went out. Total darkness. His breath hitched. He stepped back. The scraping sound was right behind him. He spun around. Nothing. He was alone. But the air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. A faint whisper reached his ears. Almost inaudible. He strained to hear. Stephen. The voice, low and guttural. A shiver ran down his spine. His legs felt weak. Something was in the house. But who? He turned to run, but his foot caught on something. He fell forward, crashing into the floor. A dark shape loomed above him. He couldn't move. The figure was too close. Too real. A sharp, cold breath grazed his ear. And then, nothing. Silence. The house felt still again. Stephen lay frozen on the floor. His body stiff, as if he'd forgotten how to move. The silence was suffocating. His pulse raced, each beat louder than the last. The air felt thick, heavy with something malevolent. He slowly lifted his head. The shape above him had vanished. But the floor beneath him was wet. He stared at the dark, spreading stain beneath his hands. His breath quickened. It wasn't water. He could smell it now, iron. The unmistakable scent of blood. Panic surged through him. He scrambled backward, his hands slipping on the slick floor. His mind raced. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. But his legs wouldn't obey. His breath was shallow. Too shallow. His chest felt tight, as though something was pressing on it. He fought for air. Something was watching him. He could feel it. From the darkness, from the corners. He didn't dare look again. He pushed himself to his feet. Shaky, unsteady. The house felt smaller now, like it was closing in on him. Every sound was amplified. The slightest creak of the floorboards felt like thunder. Every breath he took seemed to echo through the empty rooms. He had to get to the front door. His mind screamed for him to run. But when he reached the hallway, he froze again. The door was wide open. He hadn't opened it. The night outside was black, endless. But something was out there. He could feel it. In the air. In his bones. A shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. He turned, heart hammering in his chest. The room behind him was darker than before. The temperature dropped even further. He stepped forward, unwilling to turn his back to the darkness. But the cold crept in again. This time, it was different. It wasn't just the temperature. It was as if the shadows themselves had grown closer. As if they were closing in on him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for movement. Then, he saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the far corner. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong, distorted. It was there, and then it wasn't. Vanished in the blink of an eye. His heart skipped a beat. And in that split second of fear, the lights flickered once more. When they came back on, he wasn't alone. The figure stood right in front of him now. Too close. He gasped. It was inhuman. Its eyes, black and hollow, stared straight through him. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The suffocating weight of its presence told Stephen everything he needed to know. And then, it smiled. The smile twisted across its face. Wide. Unnatural. It stretched too far. Too far for anything human. Stephen's breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to shrink, suffocating him in darkness. He couldn't move. His legs refused to function. The thing took a step forward, slow and deliberate. A whisper filled the air. Not words, just sound. A hum that vibrated through his chest. It was in his bones now. A cold that sunk deeper than the flesh. A shiver rattled his entire frame. And then it reached out. Its fingers, long claw-like, brushed against his face. The cold burned. It felt like ice sinking into his skin. Stephen gasped. He jerked back, but the thing followed. A low, rasping breath tickled his ear. His vision blurred. He couldn't see the room anymore. Only the creature, hovering in the space between him and the world. He wanted to scream, but his voice was gone. Nothing but a dry rasp escaped his throat. And then, for just a second, it was gone. The air cleared. The oppressive weight lifted. Stephen blinked, disoriented. The figure was no longer standing before him. It was behind him. He turned, his heart pounding wildly. But when he looked back, the room was empty. The thing was gone. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling. It was still there. In the air. In the corners of his mind. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He stumbled toward the door. But it was still open. Beyond it, the dark world outside loomed. No sound. No movement. Just the empty stretch of night. His feet carried him forward, almost against his will. His thoughts were a blur. He couldn't think. Just run. But the door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the house. Too late to turn back. He was out now. Out in the cold. The night air hit his lungs, sharp and bitter. He didn't look back. But he could hear it. Soft. So soft. A whisper in the wind. Stephen. The voice called his name again, barely audible. It didn't belong to anyone. He knew that. But still, it pulled him forward. He quickened his pace, eyes wide, desperate to escape. But the shadows followed him. The longer he ran, the darker the night became. Every step felt like it was taking him deeper into the unknown. He stumbled, his breath ragged. And as he glanced behind him, there it was. The figure. Lurking in the distance. Watching him. And in that instant, Stephen realized. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was him. His heart hammered in his chest. The realization hit like a cold wave. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was him. He stumbled, his legs heavy as lead. The figure didn't move, but it was always there. At the edge of his vision. Always in the dark. He could feel it. Everywhere. The night seemed to close in tighter. The whisper came again. Stephen. Closer now. He whipped his head around, desperate, but there was nothing. Just the endless black of the night. No streetlights. No sound. Just him. And the thing following him. It was inside his mind now. In the corners, in the shadows of his thoughts. He couldn't shake it. His body was moving on autopilot, but his mind was trapped. Paralyzed. The streets were empty. Nothing but the distant sound of his breathing. The figure was gaining. He could hear its footsteps now. Slow. Methodical. A steady rhythm behind him. Stephen didn't dare look back. His legs burned, but he pushed forward. He had to get away. He had to escape. But no matter how fast he ran, the sound of those footsteps never stopped. He glanced over his shoulder. A flicker of movement. The figure was still there. But now, it was closer than before. He gasped, stumbling to a halt. His breath came in short, desperate bursts. The cold had settled into his skin. It was suffocating. He turned. And froze. Standing before him, in the middle of the empty road, was the thing. The figure, now fully formed. Its face, no longer a blur, stared directly at him. And Stephen saw it. The eyes. Black. Endless. They weren't eyes at all. They were voids. Absence. A hollow nothingness. A sudden wave of dread crashed over him. He tried to move, but his body was paralyzed. Frozen in place. The creature tilted its head, studying him. Its mouth opened. But no sound came. It just stared. Stephen's heart raced wildly in his chest. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't. A hand, cold as ice, reached out. It touched his face. And then, everything went black. Silence. Complete and absolute. For a moment, Stephen wasn't sure if he was alive. His body was numb. His mind, a void. But then, a feeling started to seep in. It was cold. Excruciatingly cold. Like ice running through his veins. He gasped, his breath sharp in the frigid air. His eyes flickered open. Darkness. Thick and suffocating. He couldn't move. Couldn't speak. His arms felt weighed down, like they were bound. Something heavy was pressing on his chest. He struggled to take a breath, but it was impossible. Every inhalation felt like his lungs were being crushed. A faint sound echoed in the distance. A soft, rhythmic thumping. Like a heartbeat. But it wasn't his. It was too slow. Too deliberate. Then, a whisper. Not in his ear. But in his mind. Don't fight it. The voice was cold. Alien. It slid into his thoughts, curling around him. The pressure on his chest increased. He gasped again. The air was thick now, heavy. There was something here. Something close. Something watching. Something waiting. His fingers twitched. Then his hand jerked. He felt the cold air, but there was no feeling in his fingers. He couldn't see anything. But he could feel it. The presence. It was right beside him. It had always been there. His eyes widened. A shape. A shadow. It was moving around him. Too fast. Too silent. He tried to scream, but no sound came. Only the pounding in his head. The blood rushed in his ears. The weight on his chest, crushing. The whisper again, this time louder. Stephen. You can't run. The voice was almost familiar. It made his skin crawl. Made him tremble. He tried to move, but his limbs wouldn't respond. It was as if something was holding him in place. Something, or someone. Something in the darkness. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. The heartbeat grew louder. Closer. Faster. He could feel it. A low, steady thrum. Right beneath his ribs. His heart. Was it his heart? No. It was something else. It was the thing. The presence. The creature. It was inside him. And then he felt it. Cold fingers curling around his throat. Tight. Too tight. Squeezing. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't see. Everything went blurry. He tried to scream again. Nothing. No air. No sound. Just the crushing force around his neck. The weight of it. Of the thing that had taken him. And then, nothing. Darkness. Total. Unforgiving. Silent. And then, a light. A flicker. Barely perceptible. It cut through the black like a razor. Stephen gasped, his lungs desperate for air. He was alive. But it wasn't the light he expected. It was wrong. Harsh. Sickly. A pale glow that seemed to distort everything it touched. His vision swam, pulling him from the suffocating void. He blinked rapidly, trying to focus. He was no longer in the street. No longer outside. He was in a room. But it wasn't a room he recognized. The walls were a dull gray peeling. The air reeked of mildew and rot. Flickering overhead, the single light bulb buzzed, casting weak shadows on the cracked tiles below. He couldn't move his arms. His hands were tied. Rope. Tight. Too tight. The knots dug into his wrists. Panic surged. Where was he? What had happened? His head throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. He pulled against the restraints. Nothing. The room was small. Empty. Save for a dark corner where something shifted. His heart raced. The shadows in that corner moved, then stopped. It was watching him. He could feel it. Then, a soft sound. The scrape of metal against stone. Slow. Deliberate. His eyes darted around, but all he could see were the flickers of the light. The shadows felt alive. He was trapped. There was no escape. Not now. His breath quickened again as the scraping grew louder. Closer. And then it stopped. Dead silence. The room felt colder. Colder than it had been. He could feel the sweat on his skin turning to ice. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate. Something was coming. He could hear its breathing now. Low. Heavy. Steady. Each exhale seemed to vibrate through the walls, through his bones. Closer. Closer. Until. A voice. A whisper. Familiar. It chilled him to the core. Stephen. It was his name. But it wasn't human. It wasn't even real. His eyes went wide as the thing moved into the light. A figure. Tall. Lurking. Its shape warped and bent in ways that didn't make sense. Its face was twisted, distorted. Not a face at all. Just something. It had no eyes. Just hollow, empty sockets. Its mouth was stretched wide, impossibly wide. The smile. He recognized it. It was the same one he had seen before. The same thing from the house. The creature. The entity. It reached toward him, its fingers long and claw-like, crackling with the same cold air that filled his lungs. Stephen's body screamed to run, to fight, to scream, but he couldn't. He was bound. Helpless. The cold fingers brushed his skin, sending a surge of ice through his veins. The creature leaned in, its mouth opening wider, revealing nothing but darkness. And then, it whispered. You're mine now, The whisper echoed in Stephen's skull, like an unbearable pressure pressing in on his mind. You're mine now, He could feel the words seep into his thoughts, twisting them, drowning him. His body froze. A cold wave swept through him, paralyzing his every limb. The creature's presence loomed over him, suffocating him, pressing against him with an unnatural weight. It moved closer, and its cold breath filled his ears. He could feel it, its icy tendrils wrapping around his very soul. He fought to breathe, but the air was thick, heavy. The light above flickered again, buzzing like a dying insect, casting grotesque shadows that stretched and twisted in impossible directions. The walls of the room seemed to bend, closing in on him. Stephen's chest tightened as if a vice were slowly crushing his ribs. The creature's long fingers brushed against his cheek again, cold and slick, sending a jolt of pure terror through his body. It leaned in, its empty sockets now inches from his face. He could see the void in those blackened eyes. See the darkness that swallowed everything. The thing, it didn't need to speak. Its presence was enough. Stephen could feel it, deep within him. It was feeding on his fear, on his helplessness. His breath came in shallow gasps. But the thing wasn't finished. No, not yet. It reached forward with a clawed hand, and the room grew colder still. Stephen's teeth chattered violently, his body unable to escape the paralysis. He felt the creature's claw gently press against his throat. A sharp, unbearable cold that made his skin burn. The pressure increased. He couldn't scream, couldn't fight. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading into blackness. Then, a flash of light. For just a second. It cut through the suffocating darkness like a blade. A figure. A silhouette, standing in the doorway. No. Not a figure. A person. A woman. Her eyes locked onto Stephen's, and for a brief moment he saw something. Someone. Real star. Something alive. The creature recoiled, as though it had been burned. The light flickered again, and for just a moment, the room seemed to reset. The walls returned to their dull gray. The air, less suffocating. The pressure on Stephen's chest faded. The woman stepped forward, her face shadowed but determined. She whispered something, soft, barely audible. Then, in one swift motion, she reached out. Her hand collided with the creature. A spark. A crackling burst of light erupted in the room, sharp and blinding. The creature screamed, its voice raw and distorted, tearing through the room like a scream from hell. Stephen winced, his body shaking from the force of it. The creature's form began to twist violently, as if something was trying to tear it apart. The woman's eyes glowed now, bright, fierce. She reached into the air and, with a single word, slammed the creature back into the darkness. The air cleared. The cold receded. Stephen blinked, his vision slowly clearing. He was alone again. The woman was gone. The room was empty. The creature was nowhere to be found. But the weight of what had just happened remained. He could still feel it. The thing inside him. The thing that was always there. He stood shakily, his wrists raw from the ropes. His head pounded, and the world around him seemed distant, unreal. But one thing was clear. He was alive. For now. And whatever the creature was, whatever it had been, it wasn't gone. Not really. It had left something behind. And it would come for him again. Stephen's legs felt like rubber as he staggered to his feet. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had the woman been real? Or had she been another trick of the creature's twisted influence? The room was still. Too still. He glanced around. The walls were cracked and grimy, the floor cold and hard beneath him. But there was no sign of the thing. No sign of the woman. Only the lingering echo of that horrible scream. He reached up, touching his neck. The skin was raw, burned from the cold grip of the creature. But there was no blood. Nothing physical. But something had changed inside him. He could feel it. Deep within. A lingering weight. A presence that hadn't been there before. Something was attached to him now. He could feel it pulsing, like an invisible thread wrapping around his mind, tightening with every passing second. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The creature had retreated for now, but it would return. Stephen didn't know how he knew, but he did. And when it came back, he wasn't sure if he'd survive it. His eyes darted around the room again. No windows. No doors except the one he had entered through. That same door was now shut tight. But there was something different about it. A faint glow, a shimmer. He took a tentative step forward. His fingers brushed the handle. Cold. Familiar. It felt wrong. But he had no choice. If he stayed here, he was as good as dead. The creature would find him again, and this time, he might not be able to fight it off. He turned the handle. The door creaked open. And there, on the other side, was the hallway. Narrow, dark, and stretching endlessly. A soft glow came from far down the corridor, but everything else was cloaked in deep shadow. No sound. No movement. He hesitated. His heart raced. Was it safe to go through? But the longer he stood there, the more the pressure inside him grew. He needed to move. He stepped out into the hall, feeling the weight of the air around him, as though the walls themselves were watching. Every step he took echoed in the silence. Each footfall louder than the last. He turned the corner, his breath quickening. The hall seemed to stretch out forever. The faint light ahead was growing brighter now, drawing him in. Closer. Closer. But then, he heard it. A sound. Soft. Barely audible at first. A scraping, like nails on stone. A whisper. Low. Familiar. Stephen. He froze. The voice. It was the same voice. The voice of the thing. The creature. The whisper grew louder. More insistent. It wasn't just in his head now. It was coming from behind him. He spun around. The hallway was empty. No one. Nothing. But he could feel it. It was close. So close. The walls seemed to shift, to warp. A shadow crossed his path. No, multiple shadows. They moved together, closing in. And he realized, with sudden horror, he was not alone. Not anymore. And whatever it was that had followed him, whatever had waited in the dark, it was coming for him again. Stephen's heart pounded in his chest, the sound drowning out everything else. The shadows, he could feel them closing in on him, crawling along the walls, sliding across the floor. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, as if the air itself was bending around them. He could see them now, darker than the darkness surrounding them. Figures. More than one. They slithered, contorting, melting in and out of existence, their edges constantly shifting. His body screamed at him to run, but his legs were frozen. Every instinct told him to turn around to get away, but it felt like the very air was thickening, making every movement a struggle. Then, the whisper came again. "Stephen." It was louder now. Closer. The sound was like fingers scraping against glass. Sharp, jagged. He looked down the hallway. The light was brighter now, but it was a sickly yellow, flickering in and out of existence. It felt wrong. It was pulling him toward it. And yet, he couldn't move toward it. Not without feeling like he was walking straight into the jaws of something far worse than whatever lurked in the dark behind him. The whisper came again, more urgent this time. "You belong to me now." He couldn't fight it any longer. His feet started to move, slow at first, then faster, driven by something that wasn't his own will. He took a step back, then another. The shadows grew, stretching toward him like hungry hands. His skin tingled cold, as though 1,000 invisible fingers were brushing against him. The walls seemed to pulsate, breathing with a slow rhythm, as if the house itself was alive, aware of him. He turned, looking for an escape. Anything. But the hallway had changed. It was no longer a simple corridor. It had transformed into a labyrinth, twisting, bending, stretching into impossible angles. The door was gone. The way out vanished. He was trapped. Panic surged through him. His chest tightened, and he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The shadows were closer now, reaching, pulling. He felt them on his skin, like ice crawling beneath his clothes, cold seeping into his bones. He couldn't feel his feet anymore. He couldn't feel his hands. All he felt was the pressure, the weight of them, of the things that had claimed him. And then, without warning, one of them stepped forward. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a grotesque mockery of a human. A twisted version of himself. Its features were distorted, skin stretched tight over hollow bones, eyes wide and empty. The thing reached out with a long, spindly hand, its fingers brushing Stephen's cheek with an unnatural gentleness. The touch sent a shiver through his body, but it wasn't cold. No, it was something else. A deep, invasive feeling. A violation. "You are one of us now," it hissed, its voice echoing in Stephen's mind. Stephen wanted to scream, to fight back, but it was as if his body had been shut off from his will. He could feel the thing's presence inside him now, moving, twisting, settling into his mind like a parasite. The woman's cold eyes watched him. "We are all bound by the same thread now," she whispered. Her words were sharp, each one a dagger plunging deeper into his thoughts. The creatures circled closer, closing in on him like a pack. The hum was deafening now. The light flickered above them, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, suffocating him, taking away every shred of his humanity. He wasn't Stephen anymore. Not the man he had once been. He was something else. Something other. Something cold. Something empty. He could feel it, deep within him, the final fracture, the complete loss of himself. And then, the woman's voice again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Embrace it, Stephen. And in that moment, Stephen knew. There was no escaping it. No running. No returning to what he had been. He was theirs now. Forever. A part of the darkness. A part of the void. A part of them. The darkness clung to him, suffocating, filling every breath with its weight. Stephen's body, no, whatever he had become, was no longer his to control. It felt as if the very air around him was thickening, pressing in from all sides, closing him in. The woman's cold eyes still locked on his, watching him, seeing through him. The creatures around him were shifting now, their forms flickering in and out of existence, their movements impossibly fast. Each one seemed to wear a mask of familiar faces, twisted, deformed versions of people he once knew, their features stretched and distorted into grotesque parodies. It was too much. His mind cracked under the pressure, the flood of thoughts and images too overwhelming. For a moment, Stephen, or what was left of him, felt something stir inside him. A fleeting spark of his old self, buried deep beneath the weight of the darkness. It was almost a memory. A feeling. Something soft, something warm. But it was quickly drowned out by the creeping cold, by the endless hum that now vibrated within his bones. The woman stepped forward again, her figure blurring as she moved. Her voice, though soft, cut through him like a razor. This is your new reality, Stephen. Your new beginning, It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was an absolute truth. He could feel the truth seeping into his veins, infecting his blood, spreading throughout him until there was no room left for anything but the cold, the darkness, the emptiness. And yet, there was a pull. A faint tug in the farthest corner of his mind. Something still alive within him. No. It wasn't possible. Was it? Could he still escape? The woman's smile stretched wider, impossibly wide, and the hum of the room grew louder, now vibrating his teeth. You think you can fight this? She asked, her tone dripping with mockery. For a moment, Stephen was certain she could hear his thoughts, see the last remnants of defiance trying to break free. But before he could act, before he could find a way to fight, it happened. The creatures, their forms shifting and merging together, pressed closer, forming a circle around him. They weren't merely watching him anymore. They were feeding. Feeding on what little was left of him. The coldness inside him intensified, rushing through his veins like liquid ice, freezing his blood, his very thoughts. He could feel his consciousness slipping away, being swallowed by the void that had claimed him. His body began to change. His hands, no longer hands, but twisted, gnarled things, jagged claws tearing at the air. His eyes burned with a sharp, piercing pain as they darkened, losing their human shape, replaced by something inhuman. His mouth stretched open, impossibly wide, a hunger rising within him that was not his own. The woman's voice was the last thing he heard, floating through the haze of his dissolving mind. Welcome to the void, Stephen. Welcome to eternity, And then, nothing. The room vanished. The creatures vanished. The woman's cold gaze faded into the blackness. He was alone? No. Not alone. Never alone. The dark. It was him now. And as the void stretched on around him, Stephen, if he could even still be called that, knew one thing with absolute certainty. The creature had not claimed him. He had become the creature. And the darkness was his to command. The void stretched endlessly in every direction, an infinite expanse of nothingness. There was no time here, no sense of past or future, just an all-consuming present, a weight pressing in on every inch of him. It was suffocating. But in this suffocation, there was also a strange, twisted peace. He felt the cold, yes, the biting, unbearable cold that gnawed at the edges of his existence, but he also felt power. A force unlike anything he had ever known, surging through his veins, crackling in the very atoms of his being. He was whole, and yet not. He was empty, and yet filled with something vast, something ancient. He could feel it, creeping through the endless void, moving with him, in him. The darkness wasn't just around him. It was inside him now. He tried to move, to stretch his limbs, but they didn't feel like his limbs anymore. They felt wrong. Longer, sharper, more alien. The echoes of his humanity were buried deep, deep down, beneath the layers of shadow that now bound him. There was no escape. No way back. For a moment, he tried to fight it. He tried to think. To remember what he once was. But the effort felt so futile, so pointless. His old self, his memories, were fragments now, scattered and broken like shards of glass. He could still feel it though, the fleeting warmth of a time before. A flash of light, of warmth, of life. But it was gone now. Swallowed by the vastness of this place. The nothingness that was everything. He reached out, trying to grasp at whatever remnants of himself remained, but they slipped through his fingers, dissolving into the emptiness. And then, from the depths of the void, a voice spoke. It wasn't the woman's voice. No. This voice was deeper, older, filled with the kind of power that had existed long before him. You have become part of us, Stephen. It was his voice. Not his voice, but a version of it. A twisted echo of what he had once been. A sound behind him, a scraping noise. It was getting louder, coming from just inches away. He whipped around, but nothing was there. The air grew colder still. Then, a face. A face emerged from the darkness. Twisted. Familiar. But wrong. It was his own face. Contorted in a grotesque, wide-eyed expression. The eyes weren't his eyes. They were hollow, emptiness staring back at him. The face reached out. Not with hands, but with a mouth that stretched too wide too far, until it consumed everything around it. It swallowed the light. It swallowed the air. It swallowed him whole. The scream never left his lips. It was absorbed, devoured, silenced by the darkness that surrounded him. And then, there was nothing. Complete, utter silence. The world faded. The weight of the shadows. The creature. The voice. All of it. Gone. But in the void, there was something. A lingering feeling. A pulse. A thrum. Something was waiting. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, as though time itself had stopped. But in the emptiness, something shifted. A sound. A low hum that vibrated in his skull. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, like the sound of an engine revving, but twisted, distorted. Then, a sharp crack. And another. Like bones snapping. Stephen's heart leaped in his chest, an involuntary, desperate response. He tried to move, but he couldn't. His limbs were paralyzed, frozen in place by the dark force that surrounded him. The hum intensified. Now, it was unbearable. It rattled his teeth, shook the very core of his being. His mind screamed for escape. But there was no escape. The sound swirled around him, growing in pitch, vibrating through his bones, shaking the very air. Then, another shift. A flash of light. Not the sickly, yellow glow that had pulled him in before, but something different. Brighter. Sharper. And more real. It was blinding. Stephen closed his eyes, but the light pierced through, forcing his lids open. A figure appeared, standing in front of him, bathed in that unnatural light. A woman. Not the same one from before. This one was different. She was tall, her hair flowing in an unseen wind, her face, strangely calm, but her eyes. Her eyes were filled with an endless depth, a darkness that made Stephen feel small, insignificant. A power that seemed to radiate from her, drawing everything toward her. She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. Stephen couldn't look away. Her presence was overwhelming, both soothing and terrifying. He felt a pull toward her, as if he had no choice but to follow her. But something inside him, something primal, warned him not to. Her voice came, soft but commanding. You have come far, Stephen. The words cut through the air like blades. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. But you've crossed a threshold. Her eyes darkened, and she took another step closer, her gaze locking onto his. There is no return from here. Stephen's pulse raced in his ears, louder than the hum, louder than everything. Her hand reached out, fingers outstretched, brushing his face with a coldness that went beyond the physical. You cannot escape what you have become. The words were like chains, binding him in place. He could feel them wrapping around his chest, tightening with every breath. Something cold, like ice, spread from where her fingers had touched him, crawling down his spine, spreading to his limbs. The shadows in the corners of his vision began to shift again. They moved closer, their shapes indistinct, but their intent clear. The woman's hand dropped, and she stepped back, her eyes still locked on his. You will be a part of this place now, she said, her voice almost a whisper, but it carried through the air with an unshakable force. His mind spun, trying to grasp the meaning of her words, but there was no clarity. No answers. Only a growing, unbearable pressure. The hum intensified again, as if the very walls of this place were closing in on him. And then, from the darkness, more figures. More of them, emerging from the black corners of the room. More like him. More like the woman. But twisted. The faces were familiar, but wrong. The hollow eyes. The stretched, contorted mouths. Figures moving toward him, closing in with every passing second. The woman raised her hand again, and the figures stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, with a single movement, she pointed toward him. Asterisk, you are no longer what you once were, Stephen asterisk. Her words hit him like a blow to the chest, and for the first time he felt it, the truth. The weight of it all. The creature hadn't just haunted him. It had changed him. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of this now. Part of the darkness. Part of whatever twisted, malevolent force had claimed this place. The figures in the shadows began to move again, but this time, there was no fear in their eyes. No escape for him. As they encircled him, Stephen's body started to tremble. But the trembling wasn't from fear. It was from acceptance. The coldness inside him spread further, deeper, until there was nothing left but the dark hum of the room. He realized then, with chilling clarity, he had become one of them. And there would be no way out. The coldness consumed him, deeper now. It filled every crevice of his body, every inch of his soul. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed, devoured by the shadows that pressed against him. He could feel the creatures circling closer, their cold presence pressing on his skin. The woman was still there, standing just out of reach, her gaze unblinking. Her eyes, those eyes, held a secret that gnawed at his mind, a dark knowledge of something he couldn't yet comprehend. He wasn't human anymore. Not in the way he had once been. His body trembled, but not from fear. The tremor came from the dark force inside him, trying to break free. It was in him now. His thoughts were no longer his own, twisted by the cold tendrils that had burrowed deep within him. The hum of the room seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, matching the rhythm of his new existence. A new reality. A new way of being. The woman stepped forward. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, but there was something predatory in the way she approached. Asterisk, it's not over yet, Stephen asterisk, she said, her voice like a whisper made of ice. He tried to step back, but his body wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot. Paralyzed. The shadows pressed tighter, the cold seeping further into his skin. He could feel the eyes on him now, watching him, judging him. The creatures. They were all around him, their forms shifting in the periphery of his vision. Their eyes, black hollow, bore into him, seeing everything. The voice came again, louder, shaking the very fabric of the dark space around him. Asterisk, you are no longer a soul. You are emptiness now asterisk. He felt the words pierce through him like 1,000 knives, digging into the heart of whatever was left inside him. But he didn't scream. He didn't resist. Because now, in this place, resistance was nothing. It was pointless. Asterisk, embrace it asterisk. The voice was everywhere now, surrounding him, drowning him in its power. For a long moment Stephen, if it was still Stephen, was lost in the endless echo. Then, something inside him stirred. A flicker of awareness returned. He didn't want to give in. He didn't want to accept this fate. But the force, the presence, was too overwhelming. His body, his mind, his very essence was being rewritten, replaced by something far older. Something other. The dark began to shift. The nothingness wasn't truly nothing. It was a deep, ancient presence, waiting, watching, ever patient. And now, it was moving toward him. Moving within him. He could feel it swirling inside him, coiling in his stomach, crawling up his spine. A deep, unholy hunger. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. Instead, an unearthly hiss escaped him, an expression of desire that wasn't his own. It was the darkness. The thing that had taken over. The creature. It was feeding now, growing, spreading throughout him. He was no longer just a vessel. He was the hunger. The empty void. The thing that had consumed everything, including himself. And in that moment, Stephen realized the truth. He hadn't been claimed by the darkness. He had become it. And this endless, boundless void, was his kingdom now. Forever. The void around him was no longer just an absence. It pulsed, thrummed with an energy that hummed through his very being. The hunger inside him was a constant ache, a gnawing need that had no name, no shape, no form. It was him now. Everything that he had once been was fading into irrelevance. The darkness had taken him, reshaped him into something unrecognizable, yet still undeniably alive. He was the thing he had feared. The creature. The emptiness. And now, in this eternal dark, he felt power. Something ancient, something eternal. seeping into him, filling him. His thoughts, once chaotic and fractured, were becoming sharper, clearer. The hunger was no longer something to resist. It was a calling, a purpose. He could feel it, deep within him, a thrumming pull, like a tether tying him to the heart of the void. The vast, endless expanse that was now his home, his prison, his dominion. He could feel the presence of others now. Shadows, flickering, fleeting. They were like him, twisted, bound by the same emptiness. They were not human. They were not alive. They were something else, something older. Something that had been waiting for him. His senses were growing sharper. He could hear the whispers now, hundreds, thousands of them, voices murmuring from the dark from beyond. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew they were speaking of him. He could feel their gaze, all of them watching him, waiting for something. But what? Something deep within him stirred, a growing awareness of what had to be done. The hunger, the insatiable, gnawing hunger, was not his to quench alone. It was collective. It demanded to be fed. And he, Stephen, was now its vessel. He was its mouth. Its agent. The darkness spoke to him now, not through words, but through feelings, through impulses that surged through him, demanding action. He could feel the pull of the void around him, the dark shapes that skittered in the distance, just out of sight. The echoes of those who had come before him. Those who had been consumed, twisted, and now waited in the shadow of his new reality. And as his body shifted again, twisting, bending in ways it never had before, he understood. He was no longer just part of this place. He was becoming the thing that ruled it. And the others? They were his now. They too would feed. They too would be remade in his image. For there could be no others in this void. Only him. Only the darkness. And with that realization Stephen, if that name still meant anything at all, sensed the awakening. The hunger, the need, the purpose. It surged within him. He was ready. The first one appeared. A flicker of motion in the distance. A shadow, long and indistinct, a form that wavered like smoke. It had once been human, but it was no more. Now, it was a thing of hunger, of emptiness, a twisted silhouette of what had been. It was his now. Stephen's twisted limbs reached out, and the creature didn't fight, didn't resist. It welcomed him. It joined with him. And as the darkness swallowed it whole, Stephen felt the shift. The hunger grew. The void spread. And he was no longer a victim of it. He was its master. The endless expanse of nothingness was his to command. Forever. And the shadows, those flickering haunted things, were his servants now, ready to feast. Stephen, or whatever he had become, let out a low, hollow laugh. It echoed through the dark. It was a sound without joy. A sound without hope. It was a sound made by something other. And as the void stretched on, endless and infinite, he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. In the blackness of the void, Stephen felt himself slip further into the abyss, each passing moment drawing him deeper into a form of existence he no longer understood. He wasn't human. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. The hunger inside him gnawed relentlessly, filling every crevice of his being, and yet it was no longer a curse. It was a part of him, an extension of his mind, his essence. His transformation was complete, and with it came an overwhelming, suffocating clarity. The dark was not just his prison. It was his domain. A dark pulse ran through the air, thick with a presence so ancient, so vast, that Stephen, whatever he had become, could feel its grip tightening on him. He wasn't alone in this black expanse. The shadows had always been there, waiting for him, watching as he was reborn. They moved now, whispering his name, echoing through the void with a chilling sense of reverence. Stephen had become the darkness. And as his senses sharpened, he could hear them. The whispers. They were his now. He was their master, their guide. But in this twisted new reality, there was no joy, no satisfaction in the power he wielded. There was only an endless, gnawing emptiness. A void that couldn't be filled. A hunger that would never end. He had once feared this fate. But now, he understood. The emptiness wasn't something to run from. It wasn't a prison. It was a calling. A purpose. The creatures, the shadows, the echoes, they were all a part of him now, Together, they moved as one, bound by a singular force, a singular purpose. To feed, to devour, to consume the remnants of the world that had once been. But there was no satisfaction in it. No joy in their hollow victories. For Stephen had learned the true horror of his fate. There was nothing left to consume. Not for him. Not for them. Only the endless stretch of dark, infinite, eternal. And as the void stretched on, Stephen felt his last shred of humanity slip away, as fleeting as the dying echoes of a forgotten dream. He was no longer Stephen. He was nothing more than the darkness. And in that darkness, there was only hunger. Time had lost all meaning in the endless stretch of the void. Stephen, if he could still be called that, drifted through the emptiness, the hunger within him never truly satiated. The shadows, the creatures, the echoes, everything he had once feared, were now just extensions of his own existence. The darkness had become him. He had become the darkness. But with this transformation, there was no victory, no triumph. The void was all-encompassing, relentless, yet utterly empty. There was no end to it. No place to rest. It was just him, and the vast, suffocating silence. In the depth of that silence, something began to shift. A small, fragile thought stirred in the deepest corner of his fractured consciousness. What if? What if there was still something left? What if the hunger could be quieted? Even for just a moment. The thought was fleeting, like a candle flickering in the dark, but it burned with a strange intensity. For the first time since he had become part of this eternal dark, Stephen felt a flicker of something else. A longing. A desire that was not born of hunger or emptiness. It was a longing for peace. The hunger still gnawed at him, yes. But in this quiet, in the vast expanse of nothingness, the idea of peace, of rest, began to make its presence known. It was fleeting. A whisper in the endless storm of cold, but it was there. He felt it. And for a brief, terrifying moment, Stephen remembered what it felt like to be human again. He remembered warmth, sunlight, the sound of laughter. He remembered the fleeting comfort of a life that had once been. It was a distant, almost unreachable memory. But it was there, the ghost of a time before. And as it faded back into the abyss, he knew it for what it was. A dream. A reminder of what had been lost. And in that moment Stephen, now a part of the void, understood. There would never be peace. Not here. Not in this dark. Only hunger. Only silence. And though the longing would come again, fleeting and brief, it would never be enough to fill the void. For Stephen had become one with the darkness. And the darkness would never let him go. The end was not a single moment. It was an eternity of nothingness, stretching out into infinity. And in that eternity, there was no end.